Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Tuesday in the life of coronavirus world. I don't have any updates for you at this time other than about grades. So, we were told yesterday that we are not using PowerSchool to record any grades for quarter four. What that means is basically all of the assignments that you will be given will and you do, right? I'll provide you feedback and I will list you in a tracker as whether or not you have mastered the content. Well, guys, this was not my decision. I'm doing what I told because I really like my job. Doesn't necessarily mean I agree or disagree with it. It's just the world that we live in this most complicated time ever. So do your best, stay on top of your stuff. And as things keep happening, I will keep letting you know. Thank you for being flexible. If you have any questions, you know where to get in touch with me. So let's dive into this next unit, the road to revolution. So, the road to revolution in Latin America after colonialism, after exploration, is kind of an interesting time because we talked about this social hierarchy in this caste system called castas that Europeans, or Spanish rather, bring into the New World. Well, this also gets kind of interesting because people start to turn on each other. We're going to talk about this. But before we can get too far into it, we have a few things that we need to talk about beforehand. So, there are three things that we're going to cover today. So, you have the Age of Enlightenment, you have problems in the Spanish Empire, and then, of course, the American and French Revolutions, which we all know so stinking well at this point in time. So, the Age of Enlightenment. This is at the time period in Europe that Latin America is being colonized. So you have these thinkers who are talking about the natural rights of men. So you had people who were saying that kings were not placed on the throne by God because they are human beings. They make mistakes. Governments should be based on a contract between the ruler and the ruled. Like, you can't expect to rule over people and they are just like, yeah, okay, whatever, and go about their daily business. Insert Monty Python clip here, right? I'll post that on the page. So governments exist to protect their citizens. And if citizens aren't being protected and their rights are not being protected by governments, Enlightenment thinkers said, then they have the right to overthrow their government. This is the natural rights of man. Insert John Locke, right? That's where this comes from. The natural rights of men are life, liberty, and property. Now, Thomas Jefferson changed that because he didn't want the South justifying slavery any more than they already did, so he changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So Locke also said that if governments violate this natural rights of man, then the citizens have every right to revolt against the tyranny. And that's where we have the American Revolution come into play. Before we get into that, we have to talk about the issues that were already happening within the Spanish Empire themselves. So everything that you see in blue on this map is controlled by the Spanish Empire. So they control a majority of the New World. And that's really awesome for them because their wealth is derived from how much territory they control. How much territory you control equals the amount of goods and resources. And right now, everything in blue at this point in time is producing a heck of a lot of gold for the Spanish Empire, and not a lot for anybody else. But their pockets got too big for them. So they had a lot of problems at home. There was this political disempowerment that was going on. So Spanish colonies were run by a council of the Indies, which was a group appointed by the king that met in Spain and set directives that were to be put in place across the Atlantic. So these orders were demands given by this council, not even the king, by this council that said you had to live like this. So these directives were carried out by what's called viceroys, or in English colonies, these would be the governors of the colonies. And those governors were appointed by the Spanish government. These were the Peninsulales. These were the Spaniards who came from Spain and set up shop in the New World. And this created a whole bunch of problems for a lot of people because you didn't grow up here, you weren't born here, you don't know the land, you don't know the people, but yet you're in charge of telling us how to live our lives and how to do business. The political disempowerment also bled over into what's called economic disempowerment. So Spain had all of the rights to the colonial goods and resources. They were excluding all competitors from this. So their economic policy was based on Spain's benefit. So in the New World, you put people's lives in danger to mine gold, to mine other types of minerals. And then you would put it on a boat and ship it back to Spain. They would manufacture it and then send it back to you, and you would have to buy it. This sounds a little wrong, and a lot of people thought that too. So this is a political cartoon that is, a representation, or can be interpreted as a representation for colonial America. So you have, it's basically Ebenezer Scrooge, right? It's that whole Christmas Carol tale, but you can look at it as this is Spain and this is the Spanish colonies, or any colony in the New World, actually. So who cares about these poor colonists in the Americas? What's it to me? As long as I'm still getting money, as long as I'm still getting the resources and I'm benefiting from it, I don't care about anybody else. Kind of sounds familiar, right? Yeah. Well, this is where the revolutions come into play. So the American Revolution was such a success because it not only gave the United States, right, what would become the United States, their freedom, but it showed the other colonies that they could succeed in overthrowing their mother country. So the United States broke ties completely with England, so then it is possible for everybody else to break this trend, right? And then you had the French Revolution. So the Enlightenment, which took place in Paris, led many European writers to criticize the absolute monarchies across Europe. And they spread their democratic ideas. So the people of France were absolutely disgusted with the treatment of King Louis and Marie Antoinette. Let them eat cake, right? King Louis put the country in deeper in debt by helping out the Americans in the American Revolution. Now, his dad and his granddad definitely didn't leave him a whole lot of money. They left him with a whole lot of debt that just kept getting worse, all because they wanted to build this grand palace of Versailles. So people got frustrated. So the everyday working people who were poor stormed the palace and overthrew the monarchy. Like, they drug King Louis and Marie Antoinette out and threw them in jail. Now, there would be several different rounds of, like, maybe we can try this, maybe we can do what England did and limit the power of, King Louis, but that didn't work. People still weren't happy, so eventually he lost his head. So the little picture that you're seeing there, that's King Louis losing his head. Now, I do want to go back to the French, or the American Revolution, for a second. If you actually stop and think about the American Revolution, who overthrew, who led this revolution? So in colonial society, you had the upper crust, which are the people who have direct ties to the mother country, right? So in this case, it would be the people who had direct connections to the king in England, or had agreements with the king in England, or had ties directly to England. Then you had the middle class, that were those, born here, had businesses established, were frustrated that everything that they were making or everything that they were producing was being taken and, you know, taken back to England and then resold to them. You had the Stamp Act, you had all this stuff that was directly affecting them, and then you had the poor people, essentially. You had that lower class. Now, you know, we can say a lot about the American Revolution. It was fantastic, right? Because we gained our freedom. But who actually gained their freedom in this case? The middle class did. So the middle class is actually the one that wanted to maintain the status quo, but maintain the status quo in their favor. So, what that meant for the American Revolution is that the status quo would shift from the king in England to benefiting the middle class and also the upper class if you renounced your ties to England. It didn't help out the slaves. It didn't help out the poor people. It just helped out the middle class. And that middle class was really awesome about getting everybody involved in it. Even my ancestors from Virginia fought in the American Revolution, even though they were backwoods mountain hillbillies who wanted nothing to do with it. But if you make it personal, then everybody will get involved in it. And that's what they did, is they made it personal to every single person, even though my ancestors who lived in the mountains didn't have a whole lot of money. They didn't own business. They just had a farm on top of a mountain that nobody else wanted. So the middle class in the Americas is what, shaped the American Revolution. In France, you had the three classes, right? Or what was called the three estates. You had, obviously the king above, but you had the clergy, you had the military, and then you had everybody else. And it was that third estate who finally had enough. It was those poor people, the people that had to pay the taxes, the people who were being crushed by this debt, who rose up against the military, the clergy, and the king. So that was a totally bottom up movement. The French Revolution was meant to support and give voice to everybody, not just one specific class. It was to everybody, like from truly the bottom up. The American Revolution was from like the middle up, and they brought people with them. Like the people of the American Revolution realized that if they didn't have the support of the lower classes, if they didn't have the support of every single person, they never would have won, because the people who were fighting in the army, the majority of them came from towns or areas like my ancestors lived. So they made it personal. In France, it was already personal, and they, like, everybody just off with their heads. Everybody lost their heads. If you were a noble and you still lived in France when they were overthrowing and going through revolution, you didn't live very long. Let's just put it that way. So this leads us to the causes for the Latin American independence movement. So first, there was this influence of the Enlightenment ideals. People read, people were still, corresponding with friends back home. You had the successes of the revolutions in the American and in America and France, and then you had this ever increasing demand from Spain to control trade with the colonies. So we've seen this pyramid before, right? And I just wanted to go over it one more time so that you understood where I'm going here. So you had Peninsulars who were at the top. They were native Spaniards. Underneath them, you had the Creoles. They were pure blood European, but they were born in the New World and never once saw Spain. Then you have the mestizos and the mulattoes. So that's the Indians. The mestizos were the Indians mixed with European blood, and the mulattoes were African mixed with European blood. And then, of course, you have the Indians and the Africans at the very bottom of the totem pole. Now, all of this eventually flows downriver. The ideas of the Enlightenment, the American and French Revolution, the issues with Spain trying to control the trade, and then this castas system that was set up by Spain eventually all ends up flowing downriver, and then chaos ensues. So there are four specific leaders that emerge during this time in various regions around Latin America. So you have Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, you have Miguel Hidalgo in Mexico, you have Dom Pedro in Brazil, and you have Simon Bolivar in South America, specifically Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. So let's talk about Toussaint for a little bit. So Toussaint was a Haitian slave who was inspired by the French Revolution. He began his military career as a leader in 1791 during the slave rebellion in Saint Domingue. Saint Domingue was right next door, right? San Domingo, which we call today, right? That's where he started, and he actually started on the opposition side. He actually joined the military for Spain because he didn't agree with the way the French were treating the slaves. So, eventually, when France came out and said that they were doing away with their harsh slave codes and that they were going to, you know, rethink the way that they were treating human beings, that's when he switched sides. He went from Spain back to the French. So he became a military leader. And he joined the French just after the revolutionary government abolished slavery. So Haiti became the first of the Latin American colonies to gain their independence in 1804. So some interesting things about Toussaint. If you want to watch the documentary from PBS called Égalité, it is a fantastic documentary, and you actually learn a lot about Toussaint. First and foremost, Toussaint was a slave who was freed by his owner, who was given property in a farm of his own, who used slaves himself. That's right. Toussaint is not an angel here. When I wrote my thesis for my master's in American history, I had this whole idea of what's called benevolent paternalism, which basically means good father. So Toussaint being a slave and being freed, it talks about how good he was treated by his slave master. So much so that when he gained property, he used slaves, and he also continued on this benevolent paternalism. Now, when the rebellion broke out in Haiti, he didn't want anything to do with it at first, but because he thought it was going to be like all the other slave rebellions and just fizzle out. But when he saw that this one wasn't fizzling and that they needed a true leader to unite all of Haiti, he freed everybody, put his wife, his children, sent them away to safety, put his former slave master and his family on a boat to the United States for safety. And then he took over as leader, and then the rest is history. He led Haiti to their independence in 1804. Fun fact, the United States did not recognize Haiti's independence until 1863. Want to take a wild guess at what was going on in 1863 in the United States? Oh yeah, the Civil War. So Haiti was the first independence movement, but it was also the first successful slave revolt. Haiti also set up the first successful all African American or Black government, and the United States refused to recognize them. Wow. So next up is Miguel Hidalgo. He is a highly educated Creole priest assigned to the town of Dolores in Mexico. We all know that Creole means that they are European blood but born here, right? It's very significant. In September 16th of 1810, Hidalgo rang the church bells and called upon his mestizo and indigenous parishioners to take up arms against the Spanish. He was also tired of the treatment the Spanish were giving to the colonies. He got a first-hand account of what this poverty looked like and realized that it was not fair. So he led a ragtag army toward Mexico City, and they unleashed a mass slaughter on Peninsuarles. If you were a Peninsuarle and you got in their way, whew, you died. More than likely died. So his ragtag group actually never made it to the capital. Instead, he was captured and shot in 1811, but his work carried on with Jose Morelos, and Jose would be successful in gaining Mexico their independence. Up next is Dom Pedro. So the Brazilian Revolution is very interesting, and I'll tell you why. So in the 1800s, the French armies actually invaded Portugal, right? So Portugal's royal family all fled to Brazil. And the king of Portugal actually returned in 1821, but his son stayed behind to rule over the colony of Brazil. What better way to control a colony in Brazil than to leave the crown prince of Portugal behind? And Dom Pedro took more power than he expected. Dom Pedro basically declared Brazil an independent country and established himself as king. That meant that Brazil and Canada to the north were the only two examples of nonviolent revolutions. That's right. All it took was the Crown Prince of Portugal saying, "We are a free and independent nation from Portugal," and that was it. Now, Brazil wasn't necessarily free because they still had a king, and that was Dom Pedro, or Pedro the First of Brazil, and that there's a laundry list that goes along there. So then you have Simon Bolivar. He was an elite Creole planter who became a military general. So if I had to put Simon Bolivar on a scale, you know that line that separates the Peninsuarles from the Creoles, he would be like right at that line. He was almost like if he had been born in, right? He would have been like king of the world. He was called the George Washington of the South America. He is known as the Liberator or Libertador. I butchered that. It makes me tongue tied. He was successfully able to liberate the territories that would become modern day Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. His namesake, right? Like Bolivia is named after Bolivar. And he had this whole idea of creating what's called Gran Colombia, which you guys will look at later. So his plan for a federated Latin America was crushed by political infighting. That meant that politics on the inside is what crushed his movement. And that's actually where I'm going to stop today. We'll pick this up a little later. Thanks, guys. Have a fantastic day.